Good afternoon. This is Gwen Webber-McLeod, President and CEO of Gwen Inc. So excited to be here for my new episode of the Leadership Journey, Living and Leading in and on Purpose. I'd like to begin by saying Happy Black History Month. And I'm so excited to say that because I firmly believe that Black history is everyone's history. And today I have an amazing guest from Geneva, New York. Her name is Dr. Lucile Mallard. Lucile was born in Statesboro, Georgia, and moved to Geneva, New York with her family at the age of 12. She was educated in the Geneva School District and later attended several colleges and institutions doing coursework to become a State of New York credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor. Mrs. Mallard retired after 30 years of service at the Canandaigua VA Medical Center. Most of those years, she worked in the alcohol and substance abuse fields as an addiction therapist. She is currently employed by the New York State United Court Systems in Canandaigua. She has been the Finger Lakes Misdemeanor Drug Treatment Court Resource Coordinator for 18 years. She's the first African American employed by New York State UCS in Ontario County. She is currently the president of the Geneva area branch of the NAACP, vice president of the Geneva Martin Luther King Committee, and she's a member of the Geneva Community Compact Steering Committee that was established in 2011 to improve relationships between the Geneva Police Department and people of color. Since 1980, Mrs. Mallard has been blessed to receive multiple honors, and I'd like to highlight a few of those for you. In 2007, she was awarded the Geneva Athena, given to women for their volunteer and professional leadership roles. In 2007, she received the Assembly of New York State highest award of recognition of service, given to the New York State citizen, presented to her by Minority Leader Brian Kolb. On May 17th, she was the recipient of an honorary doctoral degree of humanitarian from President Mark Guerin and the trustees of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Welcome, Lucile. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I'm glad to be here myself.
Well, thank you. You know, often when we talk about Black history, and I think everyone's talking about it quite a bit right now, because the opening of Black Panther literally caused sort of this whip of energy and excitement throughout the country. And of course, when it comes to the issue of Black history, there's always topics of divergent thinking, places we're on common ground. But one of the reasons I wanted to invite you here today is because I truly believe we live in a region, the Finger Lakes region, that is rich in Black history. So I'm so honored you were willing to come here and speak with me about this today. And I think a way to sort of set the context, Lucile, is I'd love for you to talk about how your family arrived in Geneva, New York.
Back in 1957, my mother came here as a migrant worker, and I'm not ashamed to say that. Lots of people were coming from the South as migrant workers, and we settled in Geneva, New York. And I've been a citizen of the city of Geneva since 1957. And that's the way we came to New York State. My mother lived on a camp in Lyons in Wayne County. But when we came to New York, we moved to Geneva, New York.
Thank you so much. You know, I think that there are many communities in the Finger Lakes regions with very small minority African-American populations. And I think it's so interesting how people are often unsure about how our families arrived in this area. As you know, I live in Auburn, New York, the home of one of the hometowns of Harriet Tubman, and my husband's family also has a very similar history where many of his ancestors arrived into the Finger Lakes region as a result of freedom of slavery, coming to settle the communities here. And I really want to talk a little bit about Black history in the context of where we live. So one of the things I always say is that Black history is everyone's history. But to be honest, I don't always think that people treat it that way. So I'd like to get your point of view about that idea and what you personally think about Black history being the history of all Americans, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, or sexual orientation.
Gwen, I thought about this for a long time. And in order for us to understand our history, we must understand Black history. It needs to be taught more than just the month of February. Black history should be a year-round thing, and it is everyone's history. If our kids are learning things in school about science and math and American history, they should also be learning about African Americans in this country, because we have made so many contributions to this country People see movies, and I'm glad the Panthers is out, see movies or news articles or on television, all negative things about African Americans. But we have contributed so much to this country, and in order for people to appreciate it, they need to start teaching it more in classrooms.
I would agree with you, and I think that's so very true. I know I used to be the executive director of the Booker T. Washington Community Center in Auburn, New York, and we were very, very Afrocentric in that facility because, like Geneva, the African American population in Auburn is relatively small in comparison to the entire population. And, you know, often during this time of year when we would be teaching the kids their history, there would be so many times that they were just shocked to discover that an African American did the first open heart surgery, or that an African American created the stoplight. And often in their pride, they would go to school and say those things, and then they'd come back and say to myself and my mentor, Florence Ray, well, when we get to school, no one believes that we're telling the truth. So we would arm them with lots of paperwork to say, well, take this to your teacher so they would understand. And you're so absolutely right. Even the White House was built by slaves, right?
Correct.
There's so much of our history that's integrated into the foundation of this country. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the phenomena of the Black Panther movie. Why do you think people are having such a strong response to it, and one of Black pride? I've really enjoyed just watching everyone dressed up in their African garments. Why do you think that this film is having such an impact in the country right now?
Because most films are negative portrayals of African American people. And even in Geneva, we don't get many African American movies that stays in the area for a long time. But my daughter told me that Geneva has agreed to extend it for 10 more days in the city of Geneva.
That's wonderful.
The kids are seeing people who they can feel positive about. I haven't seen the movie, but I've heard so many positive things about it that I am planning on going to see it.
Wonderful. Well, we actually went this weekend and took our 3-year-old grandson. And although the content was really over his head, just the visual, the first time he saw the main character, T'Challa, he just like screamed out loud, like, look, mommy, look. And a lot of what's going on around this film has to do with representation and the importance of African American children seeing people who look like them in politics, in local government, in state government, in schools. You know, many children of color in the Finger Lakes region could spend their entire academic career and not see one person that looks like them in their building. So to have films and to be able to open up this conversation in our region is really, really important. You know, some years ago, the Geneva Historical Society did a project on African Americans in this area, and I was really intrigued by that. And actually, I used some of that work as part of my master's degree research project, because I did it on the strategic development of African American leaders in the Finger Lakes region. I think you were one of my survey respondents, actually. So could you talk a little bit about that project and what it meant to you and African Americans in this immediate community?
Kathy Grover became the director of the Historical Society, and she is the person who did all the research, interviewed some of the youth from Geneva High School, participated in their program, and it brought to life real people in our area who people outside of the area were not aware of. And the Kennedys and the Blues, the Black churches, when they first got organized, it made a great impact to see stuff put in a history book about African Americans in the city of Geneva.
I was so proud and so thankful that I had that content to help shape how I wanted to approach my research project. So you have a very important position that we were jokingly saying that you've had like forever. You are the president of the local NAACP, and would you be willing to talk a little bit about the NAACP and why you think this organization is still significant in 2018?
Because racism still exists.
Yes.
The problems that they had when the organization was first founded in 1909, we're still talking about some of those same issues today, Gwen. And I've been the president, you're right, for a long time. And the reason I stay involved is because young people today don't see things like we saw them years ago. the discrimination, the segregation, and it is still there. And sometimes people think, well, I've gotten over, and I really don't need the NAACP. And I have to tell you, sometimes it's hard to get people to become members of the NAACP. But it's important that it stays in place because of education. They have different programs now, voter registration. They got more people out to vote in the last few elections. And then I think people went to sleep after Obama left, but they need to wake up again and get involved in community activities and civil engagements. Get out, not only register to vote, but get out and vote because changes need to take place. Right. The NAACP is here to stay, and one of the things that's significant about it and what I love about it is not only now working for the Black community. It is an organization that is fighting for the rights of every human being on this earth. Right. And I think one of the reasons, and you probably know it, the reason they never changed the name from National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, because they wanted to include all colors of people in the organization. Right. So it's here, it's going to stay here, and people need to get involved and do some things in their community that will make a difference. I live with kids that I refer to as the hip hop generation, and a lot of the young leaders I mentor, I refer to them as hip hop generation leaders. And I observe that there's interesting tension between those of us who would see ourselves as Black people or African American people who came up in the civil rights movement, and the young what I would call hip hop generation leaders or millennials, right? And I think that, getting them to understand that the issues that existed for their parents and their grandparents are still present in their own lives. They might just look different and be manifesting differently is really one of the challenges. So what kinds of things are you all doing here locally to engage young people in conversations about Black history, racial dynamics, and the role that they can play in being change agents on these important issues? In the church, most organizations or Black families put a lot of value in church activities. And at my own church in Geneva, our youth have started to interview every elderly person in the church, and on Sundays they're presenting the Black history of the people in our church.
That's amazing.
What we just did as a result of what happened in Geneva, the Community Compact, we had a forum just on the 10th for youth and police conversation at the Ramada Inn. We had several youth come and had a chance to sit down and talk to police officers. We plan to do a follow-up, and hopefully the next time we'll have more young people involved. We try to diversify, their thinking, try to let them know that, there is a difference than the hip-hop leaders, than the old leaders. They'll tell us, oh, you're so old, you need to sit down somewhere. But if the older people sit down, the younger people will never know how they got where they are today.
Absolutely. That's funny because I'm observing that as well in my work, and that I think that it's so important. Both of my parents were born and raised in the Jim Crow South and had real-time experiences of being in the back of the bus. I know when my father was stationed in Vietnam, my mom took us to a movie theater, and we were like, oh, Mom, it must have been so exciting for you to come to this theater. And she said, it wasn't until recently that I could even walk in the front door of that theater. Or times where our family would be traveling and we'd still have to sleep by the side of the road, only to discover as women that we were sleeping in that car by the side of the road because my Army officer father and my teacher mother were not allowed to check into hotels. And I do think it's so important to keep not only our children connected to that history and the impact that has on how they see the world today, but kids across cultures and communities. So I'd like to talk about this a little bit.
Can I just say something
please do.
Too
I
about
would appreciate that.
When you said your mother and your father, I lived that life.
Right.
Before I came to New York State, it was segregated schools, Black teachers, Black preachers, business owners. When we came from Georgia to New York State, we rode on the back of the bus until we got to Washington, D.C., and then we were allowed to move. But we were already comfortable sitting in the back, so that's where we stayed.
Right.
So the history that you're talking about, your parents lived through,
Right.
I lived through that.
Yeah.
Going down south and taking food in boxes so you'd have a lunch because you couldn't stop at a restaurant and eat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can't say enough about why it's important for young people today to recognize all of that hard work, even lost lives, that happened as a result to make it possible for them to be all of who they are today. So I'm really excited to hear that you're doing things to continue engaging young people in your community. I'd like to talk even a little more about this because in our region, in the Finger Lakes region, there are small pockets of African Americans throughout the Finger Lakes region. So often when I'm called or invited into a school district or even an institution of higher education to talk about the topic of diversity and inclusion, or often to be a speaker for Black History Month, I'm in rooms with predominantly white people having this conversation. And I think what I'd like to talk with you a little about is why do you think it's important for people in Finger Lakes communities, even if they don't have an African American family in their community, to learn about Black history, talk about it, and embrace the idea of diversity and inclusion? What's your thought about that?
My thought about that is they need to be teaching this in the school, even if it is an all white neighborhood, white school. They need to teach it so the kids, sometimes they'll never get exposed to dealing with a person other than their own race. So by teaching it in school, kids go home and talk to their parents about it. So the conversation of race will come up more frequent if it's being taught. So I think there's some issues going on now that we're meeting about, that because a statement was made inappropriately in an assembly that was supposed to be, and to honor Black history. But because the person was naive about the way they approached the subject, it came across to making the kids feel hostile.
Yes.
So the more we talk about race, the more we try to have inclusion, education, I think the better things will be for everyone, this whole country, and even outside of our country. If we understand and respect each other, and especially if it's not being taught in schools, kids, I think that's one reason the movie Panther is so popular.
Yes.
Because when I first became an NAACP president, I'll have to speak from my own personal experience, going to state conventions and seeing people my color, doctors, lawyers, judges, it made me want to go back and improve my educational skills. So when you have those types of role models, it gives kids pride in being who they are.
Right. I just love that you're saying it that way. I am in the leadership development business, and one of the things that I'm observing in the diversity and inclusion work we do out of my company is that the trend data is saying that the workforce itself is becoming more millennial, more brown, and more female. And when I'm talking in predominantly white school districts about why it's important to expose children and in higher institutions of higher education, young adults, to multiculturalism and specifically African American history, since we're talking about it in the context of Black History Month, part of the reason is that you might live in Geneva or Auburn and seldom be around Black people, but the minute you leave your community and move to a larger area, your boss could be someone who is not like you at all. And I offered to school leaders that it's part of their academic contract, I think of it that way, with parents and students, to prepare young people to live in the real world. So if that trend data holds true, it's highly probable that someone Geneva and Auburn are considered cities here, Cato, some of these more rural communities, that these young people are going to move to other places and live with people who are unlike them. The other thing that I think parents and adults need to pay attention to is that today's kids are all listening to the same music. And hip hop culture and music has taken over the world. I even joke because you hear people of our generation using phraseology that came out of that culture. And so I also think that I'm observing that a lot of young people are more open about the ideas of diversity and inclusion than their parents are, even if no one brown or black lives where they are, because what they're hearing on social media, on music, seeing on TV is impressing them, and everyone's listening to that music. However, this tension still exists, and I love this quote. I think it might have been by Zendaya or one of the young women of color that's on the Disney Channel, and she said, "I find it intriguing that we live in a country that loves African American culture but acts like it doesn't like African American people." So I think that also speaks to why we want to make connectivity to our history, because it's so easy, I think, for young people that aren't of color to just experience us as entertainment, movies, just that comment that was made recently about LeBron James, "Shut up and dribble," by Laura Ingraham on Fox News. I think that those kinds of things can be challenged in districts where there aren't kids of color, out of the need to prepare them to live in a larger world. What do you think about that?
You're absolutely right. And the more they get exposed to it in school, the better they will accept it and respect it. And when they go home, I try to tell people, if you hear people talking negative about an African American or a black person today, when you're not there tomorrow, they're going to talk about you. So you need to try to put the negativity away and try to embrace the differences. And I think it would be to everyone's benefit. So I totally agree with what you said.
Right. And the other way, and Lucille, I'm sure you're involved with this too, is that I see it as an issue of economic development. So here we are right now in Seneca Falls, the home birthplace of the women's rights movement. Thousands of people come here every year to visit the museums. We have the wine trails, we have all of that. And I've even been observing at the community level that town and village leaders are also now having to think about how to deal with issues of diversity and inclusion, because more and more diverse people are coming into their communities to conduct business. And one of the things and there's a lot of colleges in this area as well. So, one of the things that I'm talking about too with leaders that I support is why it's important to look at embracing diversity and inclusion and helping people understand the diversity of people who may come into the community. It's a business issue. And all it takes is one bad experience for the economy to be impacted. And so does the NAACP have conversations with business leaders about diversity and inclusion as well? And in what context?
It's strange that you say this. I was at Hobart William Smith Colleges just last week and celebrating Black history, and I did a presentation of diversity and inclusion to their advisory board. And the feedback I've gotten from that is, we're going to invite you back to do a broader range of people, not just the group of people who were there present at that presentation. And it was really accepted. And I told them, I said, when I come in and I talk, I am going to talk and be realistic about it. So don't think that I'm coming in and just kind of sugarcoat things to make you feel good. I'm going to tell you some things that's going to open your eyes and make you get out of your comfort zone. Right. And it did. Right. And it was well received.
That's great. I think it's so important to do that. Again, I'm finding that leaders that are awake, because a lot of leaders I work with are asleep, they're not conscious of what's really going on around them, truly are paying attention to that trend data. So even in my own company, Lucille, we are more and more being invited to do diversity and inclusion work. And one of the things that I'd like to share with you is actually something that you helped me discover through my master's research project, which really was about the strategic development of African American leaders in the Finger Lakes region, is that for many companies in this area that are looking to embrace diversity and inclusion as a business strategy, one of the things that they have to get prepared for is something that I call hiring someone who could be positioned as the unexpected leader. So I'd like us to talk about that, and I'm sure you've had this experience. So, as a result of the findings that you and the other people that helped me do my research project, a couple of things came up, and I'm offering this up for those of you who might be in businesses or companies or in institutions of higher education, that because there are statistically so small numbers of African Americans and other minorities in the region, that when these young people come on your campuses or these professionals join your company, they could find themselves being the first and the only. So they're going to be breaking the glass ceiling in your company. And although that's historical, it creates a certain amount of stress for that person. And when I talked to all of you about this, that stress came with the struggle to gain and sustain credibility. And it's not that you're not qualified for the job. It's that what's causing that struggle is that people don't expect it to be you. Many people aren't accustomed to having their boss be a person of color, having a coworker who's an African American, having a student even in their classrooms who's an African American. Many students in this region are isolated in their public school and college classrooms as students of color. So the unexpected of what are you doing here also causes people to not believe that you were qualified for that opportunity. The final thing that came through in the research was that people were really concerned about leaving a legacy of leadership, because what they experienced was whether or not someone else like them was positioned to follow them into that leadership position had nothing to do with their performance or whether or not they were literally successful, but on perceptions of whether they were successful. I think that President Barack Obama is a national example of an unexpected leader. So I wanted to talk to you about that because I know that I see that a lot in upstate New York, that reality. For my sisters and I, when we moved to the Carthage Central District in the 60s, we were literally the first real live African Americans a lot of our teachers or classmates had really had close contact with. So I wanted to know if you observe that experience, that dynamic in the companies that you speak with and the work that you're doing through the NAACP and as a community leader.
Yes. Even personal experiences. I remember during my years at the VA, 30 years, when they first started talking about diversity, and there were like 1,200 employees that needed to be trained, and they selected 12 facilitators to be trained, and people had to apply, and I applied, and I was one of the chosen. And during one of the sessions, one of my co-workers said to me, "Lucile, don't you think you were selected because you were a woman and you're Black?" And I told him, I said, "No, I was selected because I'm qualified."
Yes.
And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They think that we are tokens.
Yes.
And they fail to realize that we have to go beyond and above what qualifications are to get into positions that we're in. Even in my own position, my job now at the court, being the first African American to be hired in Ontario County court system, I take real pride in that. And I've been on interviewing panels where people come in for jobs, and I have to say that a couple of people that were interviewed with me as a part of the interviewing committee were African Americans or people of color and have got hired in positions across the state because the court system wanted to diversify the court system.
Right.
So they send me sometimes as far away as Malone to even be on panels.
Right.
So they will diversify the interviewing panels.
And that is so critical. You know, there are issues of unconscious bias, I think, everywhere across the country. And I think as I do a lot of work in this region, you see a lot of it. And even in my own growing up experience, the type of racism we experienced often wasn't coming from a malicious burning crosses in their yard kind of stuff. It literally comes from stereotypes that people have who have no exposure to African American people. And I think for those of you who lead, lead, understanding that that's in the culture of your organization is critical if it's your intent to diversify your workforce. So when somebody is onboarding an unexpected leader, one of the things that they really need to do is check the culture to see if the culture of the company is really ready to receive a person of color or a woman who's going to be breaking the glass ceiling. You know, if we could shift for a little bit, I'd like to maybe have you give some tips to community leaders in the Finger Lakes region who really want to be committed to diversity and inclusion and increasing the numbers of African Americans and other minorities in their own organizations or workplaces. What are a couple of things you would say to them to help them be successful in that way?
First of all, you have to make yourself available, and you have to be committed to what you do and feel comfortable in your own skin before you can go out and recruit other people to try to include other minorities or any other kind of group that does not fit the criteria that you're expecting. One of the tips is, and the NAACP started this for me, each one, reach one. Mm-hmm. If you go out and if I see someone who I feel that is qualified to do something, I am going to encourage that person to, go for it. It's a dream, and the only way a dream will come true is if you follow it. So people need to learn how to encourage young people to step out and take a risk at doing things that not normal for them, but in a positive way.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If I could add to those things too, if you are an African American person who's really interested in pursuing something, I think if you're going to do that in this region, one of the things is you do have to prepare yourself to be an unexpected leader. So some specific tips I have for you would be claim your career. And I think that this comes from our history. I have an organization that's called You Can't Fail, Inc., and it's an organization devoted to developing the next generation of women leaders with emphasis on leading at the intersection of race and gender. But the tagline is, you can't fail because your history says you can't. And I think for those of us who live here, when we look at Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the families, the historic African American families in this region, the many churches that have been here for over 100 years, there is no reason for us to think that we can't make it. Your family moved here as migrant workers, and look at you, Dr. Lucile Mallard, right? So if you're a young person or an emerging professional who really wants to pursue something greater in your company, I encourage you to do that and do it from that perspective. You need to claim your career, find a mentor, find safe spaces to talk about when the factors or the dynamics of unexpectedness are working against you, and then develop some coping mechanisms and strategies to do so. For those of you who are leaders in the company, I think it's really critical for you to get clear about why you want to leverage diversity and inclusion and how you will demonstrate it in all aspects of your work, and to check your culture for microaggression and be willing to do something about that, and make sure that you're continually educating and training all of your management team to be diversity champions, because whether or not minorities are successful in your business is directly connected to the person that's most close in managing them. Dennis Nally, who is a high-level executive with the PricewaterhouseCoopers, says, in order for me to get my employees to believe in diversity and inclusion, I personally have to be the one walking around the company saying that I understand the different journey to leadership for minorities and women in my company, that I personally have to walk the talk. Do you agree with that idea, Lucile?
Lead by example.
Exactly.
And you have to walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yes.
So, yes, I totally agree with that.
Absolutely. And I want to say to our colleagues and leaders in the community who aren't people of color, that might be a challenging experience for you, because the minute you decide to become a diversity champion, you personally will be challenging the status quo. You'll be challenging ideas of what leadership looks like and who gets to lead in your company. If you're an educational leader, we both, I think, would just really encourage you to remember that the young people you're leading might be in classrooms full of people who look exactly like them today, but when they leave you and go to work, that's not going to be their reality. And so that we have an obligation to prepare them for the world that they're going to be living in. One of the things that I'd like to do too, Lucile, would be just to talk about what are your aspirations for the African American community? What's your wildest dream for our community and its future?
In the future, for them to really be stable economically.
Yes.
Be able to purchase their own homes, be able to send their kids to college without it being a financial burden on them, and having their children come home back to their communities and give back some of the things that they've taken away. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about each one, reach one, just because you make it to the top of the ladder, you shouldn't forget where you came from.
Absolutely.
You should reach back. There's some of your friends still at home that are struggling, so you need to try to encourage them that, look at me, I've made it, so can you.
Yes. I love that idea. That's something that I practice in my life regularly too, and it really fuels how I live my life and how I run my business. I worked on a project in Buffalo called the Communities of Giving Legacy Initiative, and one of the participants in that project said to me, Gwen, for a lot of white kids who live in more affluent or, influential communities, the sky truly is the limit. But for a lot of inner city African American and other minority group kids, the eye is the limit. What they see is what they believe they can become. And I think that really connects to your reach one and teach one, because when young people from Geneva and Auburn and Canandaigua and Ithaca, all of these communities wedged between Rochester and Syracuse, come home and have done something with their life, it says to their sibling, their cousin, their peers, the people following them, that if I see you do it, maybe I'll be able to do that too. What do you think about that?
Totally agree. Agree. And I can say that because the young women or young men who grew up in the youth councils of the NAACP, I can look around and smile. And those young men and women are entrepreneurs, are really professional people. And it has been hard trying to get a group of young people to really get involved like they were, say, 10, 15 years ago, because it's so many other things out there that's being offered to them.
Right.
And it's just depressing sometimes, because you want all of these kids to succeed, but you can look and say, this is the fruit of the youth councils of the NAACP from Geneva.
Absolutely.
And it makes me feel really proud of those kids.
Well,
your young men and women.
Your legacy is very, very powerful and forever ingrained in the Finger Lakes region. And I'm just so proud of you, Lucile. You've always actually been a role model for me and a woman that I looked up to as I was developing and growing as an African American woman in the Finger Lakes region. And I will be forever thankful for all the work that you've done, and hope that I can make you proud and inspire a new generation of young women to follow you as well. We are living in interesting times, and I am so thankful to have the opportunity to devote a podcast to the idea of Black history being everyone's history. As we watch our country feeling like, to me, it's more and more pulled apart, I think it's really critical for each of us, especially those of us who can influence young people, to think about how we position ourselves so that we can help people understand that although we stand on common ground — I love this poem by Maya Angelou that ends with a stanza that's, "We're more alike than unalike, our friends," that even though we stand on common ground, the reality is that being Black, being African American, we have places of divergent experience from our white colleagues and friends, and our family members are often very multicultural. And one of the things that I hope to offer for people to think about is, I believe that until we can stand in that gap of where there's differences and people can honor that mine and Lucile's experience and our children's experience is uniquely different than theirs, you embrace our truth, we will continue to have racial tension. So one of my aspirations for Black History Month is that we get to a place where everyone really sees Black history as their history as well. And we are so fortunate in the Finger Lakes region to have a Lucile Mallard, Dr. Lucile Mallard, and other people like you who have laid this foundation for our community. So I'd like to thank you so much and give you an opportunity just to have a closing comment.
The closing comment is, Black History Month is not the only time Black history should be taught. It's a year-round thing, and embrace it. It will take away a lot of your stereotypical thinking and will alleviate some of the fears that you have about people who are different.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Mallard, for agreeing to join me today. And as I said, I can't say it enough. Your legacy is deeply ingrained in the Finger Lakes region, and your legacy is solidified. And there will be generations of people who will grow to become everything you would like them to be because you lived here, because of you, all of us are. And I'm very appreciative of that. I like to close each of my programs with an inspiration. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is this concept that today's African Americans are our ancestors' wildest dreams. You know, one of the things that the Black Panther movie brings up is there's a quote from one of the characters who says he'd rather have jumped to his death and to be free versus being in the bondage of slavery. I'm paraphrasing it. And, you know, I think it's so important for those of us who live in the Finger Lakes region to remember that we are the direct descendants of the few who made it across those oceans in the bottom of those ships, and that we are historically obligated to live our lives in ways that make them proud and extend their legacies into the future. I think that Dr. Lucile Mallard is a great example of being our ancestors' wildest dreams, and I hope for those of you who are watching my show who are African American that you take pride in being your ancestors' wildest dreams also. And for our allies who aren't people of color, I hope that you take the time to reflect on some of what you heard today and inspire the young people around you to embrace the history of African Americans, because the truth is, because of us in our community, all of you are as well. So I want to thank you again for watching my program. This is Gwen Webber-McLeod, President and CEO of Gwen Inc. and the proud host of The Leadership Journey, Living and Leading in and on Purpose. I'll see you next month where we'll be talking about women's history, and my guest is Michelle Jones Galvin, who is a direct descendant of Harriet Tubman, and we're going to hold her up as a woman to know and care about in the Finger Lakes region. Have a great week.